The super small Insta360 GO 3 is a great camera for vlogging and catching all of the action. However, there's a common problem with action cameras, and it's their low light performance. In this video, I'm going to test the GO 3 in low light situations and share the best settings that I found. How well a camera performs in low light has a lot to do with the size of its sensor. A larger sensor means it can collect more light, have larger pixels for a higher resolution image. Now, action cameras need to be small and light, so that means a smaller sensor and poorer low light performance. There are 3 adjustments you can make to improve your camera's low light performance. You can adjust the frame rate, the shutter speed, and the ISO. The frame rate, or the frames per second, is how many times your camera is taking a still image every second. In a low light environment, you want to set the frame rate to 24 frames per second. Next is the shutter speed. The 180-degree rule states that the shutter speed should be twice the frame rate. So if you set your frame rate at 24 frames per second, the shutter speed should be 1/48 or 1/50. Following the 180-degree shutter rule creates motion blur, giving your video a more natural feel. However, in a low light environment, you may have to break this rule. If your camera's on a tripod and you're shooting a relatively still image, you want that low shutter speed. But if you want to pick your camera up and say go vlogging, you're going to notice that the light is blurring. You may have some jitters, and one of the ways to counteract that is to increase the shutter speed, maybe 1/120 or even 1/240. There are product links in the description if you decide to purchase the GO 3 directly from Insta360. The last exposure setting you can adjust is the ISO, and the ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. Generally, you want to keep the ISO as low as possible, but if the image is dark, you can boost the ISO, which makes the image brighter, but that can bring in noise, so typically you don't want to go too high. On this channel, I share all the latest action camera news, reviews, and how-tos, so like and subscribe and learn how to get the most out of your camera. I walked the streets of downtown Dallas to test out the low light performance of the GO 3. The camera is set to video mode, the resolution is 2.7K, and the frame rate is 24 frames per second. The exposure is set to auto. There are 2 reasons I set the exposure to automatic instead of manually setting the shutter speed and ISO. First, as a solo creator, I found that having to manually adjust the exposure every time the light changed was just too much, especially when you have a dozen other things to think about. You know, cameras are getting so smart that a good one should be able to automatically adjust for most lighting situations. I want to basically set it and forget it. Second, the GO 3 has a feature called low light stabilization. Generally, the electronic image stabilization in an action camera does not perform very well in a low light environment. You notice every time you take a step, the lights will jitter. The GO 3 can take care of that problem. It can sense when you're in a low light environment, and the icon for low light stabilization will appear onto the screen. If you turn that on, it helps to reduce the jitter and also any excessive motion blur. Here I turned off the low light stabilization, and you can really see the lights jitter as I'm walking through the plaza. This area is really lit up, similar to the Vegas Strip, and I think the GO 3 did well considering its small size. When recording in a low light environment, you want to get as close to the light source as possible to get a usable image. To test out manually controlling the exposure, I set the camera down, I recorded a short clip in auto, and then switched to manual so you can see a side-by-side comparison as the ISO is increased. The frame rate is 24 frames per second and the shutter speed is 1/50. I started at an ISO of 400 and increased it up to 800. After 800, I started to notice noise in the image, and I think it got too bright. Ignore the changes in the color temperature. That's just the lights from the huge TV screen changing. This time lapse also came out pretty good. The exposure was set to automatic, and I just adjusted the EV to 1. What do you think about the low light image quality? Let me know in the comments. One thing to keep in mind, there can be a big difference between what you see on the rear touchscreen and ultimately what you see on your monitor. The image on the rear touchscreen is probably going to be brighter and sharper than what you ultimately get. So it's good to do some test shots so that way you're comfortable with the quality of the image before you go in there and fully record your video and you get back and you're doing your editing and it didn't look anything like you expected it to. After playing with the settings, I found the best setting while moving is to set the frame rate to 24 frames per second, put the exposure to automatic, and low light stabilization on. The best setting while stationary would be keeping the frame rate at 24 frames per second, the shutter speed to 1/48, and adjust the ISO as needed, not going any higher than 800 to 1000. To learn more about your Insta360 GO 3, check out this video.